Hey everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be jamming in geometry nodes again. We'll create a customizable semi-procedural pipe in Blender. I'll walk you through my process for building the base pipe, adding accent details, setting up tweakable materials, and generating custom UVs for seamless mapping. Plus, I'll show you how to add material variation with a single pipe trim. Let's dive in. So let's do it. We'll go into edit mode on this curve, this Bezier curve. And I'm just going to set the spline type to poly, because we want to do a hard surface pipe. I'll tap G for geonodes after that. And I'm just going to type in curve to mesh. I'll drag out profile curve and type in curve circle. Turn wireframe on so we can see. We'll run a fillet curve on poly so that we can set the radius to something like this. And I'm just going to reduce the radius of the curve so we can see our pipe. So here it is so far. And the nice thing about using this in a curve is if I select a point here and hit Alt-S, I can actually scale it. Or if I select everything and hit Alt-S, I can scale it as well. So it gives you a lot of nice control where you can duplicate things and scale them to different sizes, all within the same object. So that's quite nice. But one thing you'll notice is when I scale it too large, this starts overlapping this bevel here, this curve fillet. So what I want to do is add some controls to compensate. So with the group input selected, I'm going to go to group, hit the plus input. I'm just going to drag this geometry up to the top again so that my socket's there. And that's going to make this open socket that we can now control. What I'm going to do is hit this little icon here and type in radius. If I drag that out into the fillet radius, you'll see that as I'm scaling the size of the pipe, the fillet radius is also changing. So that's pretty nice. But if I want to tweak that and make it slightly smaller, I can just put in a math node in between this. And let's just say maybe I want maybe I want all my corners to be that size. I can set it to that and see how it's scaling relative to my Alt-S scale now. So that's great. The next step for us will be putting some brackets in the pipe. So for brackets, I'm going to run out from this fillet curve to points, instance on points. And for this one, I'm just going to Control Shift right click and join these two together. And in the instance, I'm going to say a mesh primitive cylinder. I'm going to get a align rotation to vector and plug the tangent into the vector and then plug that into rotation. There we go. And I select the right axis and let's just bring the radius down and the depth down. So if I set this curve to points to length, then I can control the even spacing. And with wireframe off, you'll notice that there's a bit of shading issues here. We can go smooth by angle after the cylinder and just hit ignore sharpness. And that's our curve brackets. And if I want this to be a little bit less jagged as I'm positioning it along the curve, I can actually plug in a resample curve beforehand, also set to length. So you'll see that here. If I put that to a larger value, it's a little bit janky, but if I put it to a small value, it's a little bit smoother. Let's see if I turn that off. And also the direction that it's facing is a lot more accurate. So you'll see these ones here are slightly slanted before this bend, just because of how the normals are oriented. So if I unmute that, it's just going to fix that issue as well. So now that I have this set up, I can also take a semi-procedural approach where I can bring in my own custom mesh here and use that instead. So instead of the cylinder, I could just drag in a object info node, choose the cylinder, drag that in instead, And I'll drag the scale into here so that we can do this, which is a bit of fun. Just makes it easy to set it. In fact, I'm pretty happy with using that from here on out. So I'm just going to up the spacing so it feels a bit more natural, like an actual pipe. And the next thing we want to do is I just want to make sure that when I scale this, the brackets also scale. Let's take a look at that now. I might actually have to disconnect that scale so that I can use that socket that I created before. So we'll drag this in to scale, and there we go. You can see it's scaling along with the pipe size, which is quite nice. If we want to make that node spaghetti slightly less, we can just copy a group input up to here and plug the scale in from there. Okay, so what's next? I'm going to go into material preview, and let's set up a pipe material that's going to work for everything here. So I'll just use a plane for now. Go material mode and hit new, and I'm just going to find a nice generic seamless metal. So what I want to do here is I want to be able to make this pipe as long or short as I want, and I don't want to have to calculate the UVs every single time. So I'm going to hit Control T with the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. I'm going to change this to generated, and I'm going to change this from flat to box. Back in here in our GeoNodes workspace, which I'm going to pin, I'm just going to make a set material node here. Let's name this material as metal, and then I can choose metal. I'm going to apply scale, and actually what I will do instead of generated is I'm actually going to choose an object. So I'll change this to object. I'm going to choose the plane. So now the texture scale is going to fit the object. I'm going to change this to something else that is hopefully actually seamless. So there we go, that's a little bit closer. Make it metallic. There we go, we've got a dull metal. So at this stage, I'm just going to go in and add a cut here. I'll just bring this in so I can get a little loop there. I'll center the geo, and I'm going to just model a few things out here. And I think what I'm actually going to do, now that I've modeled that, is I want to combine the Alt-S scale functionality with the object scale functionality here. Okay, so I've got the object scale coming in here, and then that's being multiplied by whatever the radius value I input here is. I don't know what's happening here. Ah, I see. I think that seems to be the one caveat of this setup, is if you do a subdivide and the curve is completely straight, it's going to get some weird pinching. I think what it actually might do is down the bottom here, after the fillet, after the curve to mesh, I'm going to do a merge by distance. And let's just see if that solves that problem. Looks like it does. Fantastic. So now anywhere along this curve, I can make it bigger or smaller, even on a straight if I want to. So I could add a section here. I'll scale both of these down. I'm having fun with it now. That's very fun. Okay, so what else do we want to do? Well, let's add a little bit more proceduralism to this pipe. Now let's add a little bit more realism to this shader. So it's a bit too high frequency detail here. I'm just going to disconnect that and do a simple color just to check it. So now I can more easily tweak the roughness map here. Okay, if I plug that in, let's just go and RGB curves. I'm just going to crunch the values here so I get a smaller value range. So you see, if I just solo that, before it was super high contrast, I'm just bringing it down to something a bit more natural. Okay, so let's add a little bit more proceduralism to the shader. So I'm just going to link those materials, and let's just make a test object here so I can easily see the AO. I'm just going to make a version of this entire texture. I'm going to pull these curves right down Make it darker, go to the red channel, introduce a bit more red and a little bit more green, just to get some brown going on here. And I'm also going to make it way more rough, something like that. There we go. This is my rusty metal, that's my normal metal. And I want to mix these two together. So we'll Control Shift, right click and drag for a mix shader. And then my input, I want to do some edge mask stuff. And I also want it to be able to work inside Eevee. So the main node we use for that is ambient occlusion. Into a color ramp, we'll bring it into the factor, and I'm just going to multiply that with a math node. Let's go 5 for now, and I'll put the distance down to 0.1, and let's drag these sliders up until we can see it. So this is going to be doing my cavities, maybe 0.3. It's looking quite nice. If I just duplicate this and set this to inside and only local, and then I can Control Shift right click drag. Let's just preview this one. So this one here is giving me the convex shapes, and this one here is giving me concave, but I do need to tweak it just a little bit. I need that distance to be right down, just because I want to catch all the edges here. Let's see what this looks like together. I'll pull this factor all the way up and set it to multiply, so we're getting both at the same time. Let's have another look at our mix shader. Okay, we've got that rust coming in on the edges, and I'm just going to tweak these values a little. So one thing I've noticed is if I just want to scale this on the z-axis, it's doing a global transform there. I'm going to run a vector math node, and one of them is going to be for each axis, and one of them is just going to be for all the axes. So this I can scale however I like, but the S is just going to be a uniform scale still. So let's build out a few presets just for fun. Alright, so I've got a basic scene set up here. What I want to add to this is just a few more options. If you don't want to miss out on any videos, tools, asset packs, courses or products I create, definitely consider joining the mailing list in the description below. So I want to have that appear periodically and at random angles. So back in my pipe node, let's just pull something out from the geometry. Do an instance on points. I'm going to pin that so I can select that and drag it in. I'm just going to rename that to tap. Okay, so I've got this instance along the curve, and I want to be able to rotate it, rotate instances, and I want to use this time something called 2 radians, and I'm going to multiply that by a random value. So I've got radians multiplied by a random value between 0 and 1. Plug that into rotation. I'm going to do it, and I'm going to run a combine XYZ after that and plug it just into the Y. So some of these are kind of working, some of them are kind of not. I think to guarantee that it consistently looks good, I'm going to set this to integer. We'll go min 1, max 100, plug that back in. And since this is set to 90, that means it's only going to rotate in 90-degree increments if this is set to integer. And that should hopefully just remove kind of a little bit of randomness, because I can see that sometimes it's not quite appearing on the correct side. I might plug this into X as well. There we go. Got a little bit more variation there. Alright, so at the moment I have my procedural material set up to box project. The final layer of functionality I'd like to add to this is to be able to UV unwrap this pipe so that it can work with a range of pipe trim textures. So I'm going to break off this. I'll just hit P to separate it, and I'm going to duplicate this. I'm going to rename it first, so pipe 1. I'm just going to hit this little 3 to make it unique, and we'll call this pipe unwrapped. So to be able to test the UV unwrap of the pipe that we're going to make, I'm just going to drag in a cube, go to the shader workspace, hit new, and call it UV test. Over in the shader area here, I'm going to get color, image texture, I'll hit new, and on this generated type I'll hit color grid and go new image. I'm just going to call that UV color, and I'll hit this little shield just to make sure it's there if I ever need to close and reopen the scene. So back in my pipe GeoNodes workspace, I'm going to shift this set material just before that join, so I'm only affecting the pipe. I'll change that to UV test. So here we are, we have that material applied to the pipe. So back in the GeoNodes workspace here, what I want to do is unwrap this. And to do that, I'll need to capture some things about this axis around and this dimension along the length of the spline. So I'll need a store named attribute for the circle, and I'll name this curve X and curve Y, and I'm just going to look for a spline parameter, and we'll put the length in Y and the factor in X. So back over to our shader here, we're going to pull up those attributes. So we'll go attribute and we'll search for curve X, curve Y. I pull out the factor and run a combine, and the X goes into the X, the Y goes into the Y, and then this can go into the UV map. So you can see now we've unwrapped the pipe somewhat. I've got a little bit of pinching here. I think it might have to do with this merge by distance. So I'm just going to hit connected there, just in case. And the other fix I'll need to do is related to the object that I'm using, because at the moment GeoNodes doesn't know where the seam for this UV map is. So instead of using a curved circle, I'm going to search for curved spiral instead. And a massive thank you to Michael Bridges for his extremely useful procedural pipes geometry nodes tutorial, which I'll link in the description. He goes into a lot more depth than I currently am at the moment, so I'd highly recommend checking that out. So I'm going to drag that spiral into the geometry, and at the moment it's pretty wacky like this, and that's because we've got a radius for the start of the spiral and the end. So I'm just going to drag this out into a value for now, and we'll make those exactly the same. And then to remove this offset, I'll just hit 0. And there we go. GeoNodes is unwrapping this, and it's treating the start and end of that spiral as basically like a UV seam. So if this was unwrapped, it would just be completely flat. So over here, if I set this to all, sometimes I get a little bit of those pinching artifacts. So see how the UVs are pinched right there. And that seems to be fixed by changing this merge by distance to connected. So it seems to be unwrapping properly. So over in this material, I'm just going to Control G to group. I'll tab out. I'm going to call this pipe UV unwrap. Now I'll go over to my metal, and let's make a new metal material by hitting that little icon there and call it metal trim. We'll call it pipe trim. So back in GeoNodes, we can go to our material, select pipe trim. In the shader workspace, we're just going to reset this to flat projection, and then I'm going to delete that and search for my pipe UV unwrap. I'll plug that into the vector, and now that's unwrapping it horizontally. So whereas before in box mode you can see there's certain seam points where that box project transitions, now we've got an even distribution all the way around, and we can increase that scale on the X and on the Y for length as well. So I'm going to hit this little 8 to make it unique. I'm just going to bring in a really rough pipe trim texture. To avoid any slanted UVs here, I'm just going to up that to something a little bit higher. What I'll also want to do here now is I'm noticing that that texture is slightly skewed. So let's just go over to this mapping node, rotate on the Z by 90, and we can see this pipe trim coming along. So So here's the pipe trim I'm using. Each of these strips is completely seamless in both directions, and I'll include that in the scene file as well for you to use. And at the moment we can see that we need to rotate it, so it's going lengthways. So I'll just hit 90 on the Z, and I might need to scale it on the Y. And then when we're scaling it on the X, if I go to 0.25, you'll see it's going to perfectly line up. So a little bit more. Let's bring out the Y a little bit more. And my mistake, for some reason this mapping, the unwrap is making it work with 0.5 in this particular case. So to keep that in mind, you'll need to adjust that scale based on the map that you're using. But now we can see that if I cycle between increments of 0.25, I'll be switching between those different strips. So you can have as many or as little as you want in your pipe. And I've turned the RGB curves off for now. And just for fun, let's drag this into bump. So what I'd love to have happen in this pipe is for each time that I duplicate it, I'd like this to select a random interval, so I can cycle between those different trims. So the next thing I'd like to do is to be able to duplicate a bunch of objects and have it randomly select one of those trim strips. So for that I'll need a object info node. We'll plug the random into a combine, Y, and location. So at the moment it's randomizing the location on the Y-axis, but I need it to do it in increments. So first off, we're going to do a math node, and we'll say we've got 4 strips. So I'm going to multiply this by 4. So whatever I do, it's going to exaggerate that by 4. And then I'm going to make sure I add a rounding node, which is going to round it again to a whole number. And then I'm going to divide it by 4. And that's going to bring it back down to a quarter of its value. So it's choosing a different position, it's rounding it down to a whole number, and then it's dividing it to a quarter of that trim sheet again. So that each time I duplicate one of these, we've got a random pipe material. So now that we've set that up, we can go back over to our pipe 1. I'm just going to duplicate this scene. We'll call this pipe 2, or pipe unwrapped. I'm just going to select everything in Alt-S to scale it down to something that matches. And then if I hit L to select individual pipes and hit P, they should randomize. So one thing you might want to do to get a little bit more fine control over the material selection, so you don't have to keep duplicating until you find something that you want, is switch this from random to location. And then when you move that around, it's going to change. And to increase the potency of that, I'm just going to run another multiply, and I'll just times that by 100. So this is rotating through them. So for these smaller pipes, just keep in mind that AO distance is going to affect the shading. So for the smaller ones, you might want to drag it down. You might even want to create a material variant by hitting this icon here and tweaking one specifically for small pipes. So just going back through on this one, making sure everything's plugged in where it needs to be. So for this being our flanges, I'm just going to make sure that this socket here is connected to the scale and is set to the right value. And for that one, I'm just going to run a set material, and pipe trim is a bit of fun if you want some variation there. If you want those to be all the same, you can realize instances, so it'll be the same per pipe, so that's quite fun as well. But for now, I'm just going to do metal, and I'll set this to multiply the radius, and I'm just making sure that I've got this radius socket here set to multiply, so I can tweak the size. And now when I Alt-S with everything selected, it's always going to be relative to that, relative to the pipe size. So to fix the orientation of some of these brackets again, you can play around with the resample curve and the curve to points. So curve to points, that's going to be frequency. And I'm actually going to increase the length on this resample curve just a touch. And that seems to be getting me slightly better results. So if you're noticing on larger pipes, you're getting some weird pinching and strange orientations of these flanges, just head over to your main curve and make sure that the radius from here is divided by a high enough value to fix those issues. So our final step here is saving this out and making it usable. But hopefully this shows you an alternate way of controlling some parameters without having to go into the workspace, namely hitting Alt-S to scale something down. It can net you some pretty fun results. So using something like this method is really fun for creating kind of like a stylized wonky pipe, if it's a more cartoony type project. So it's quite fun. And don't forget, you can still go into draw mode, set it to surface, draw your pipe, hit Alt-S for scale. As a final note, you'll notice that when I go into draw mode, my flanges aren't quite aligning with that smooth curve that I'm drawing, and that's because this is being still passed through this fillet. So if I turn that off, you'll see it lines up. So I want to be able to create an option for those flanges where it's either using this output here or it's using the group output here. So a fun switch node that I found recently is menu switch. So instead of just a checkbox, you can have some options. And the nice thing about this is you can actually choose as many as you like. So in the node setting, I can hit another one and another one and another one. So if I had, say, 5 different variants of this pipe setup, I could pipe them all into here. And if I drag this out into the menu, I'd be able to select between them instead of having a bunch of switch checkboxes. So let's set one up just so we can see how it works. And I'm gonna make a little menu to go between Freehand and Poly. So let's go menu switch. And this one doesn't like being dropped in the middle, so I'll just have to manually drag it into a curve. And by default, let's say polycurve. But if I don't want that polycurve, I just want that to be a Bezier curve, I'll put that into B. Now I'm going to drag this top out into the switch here, go into my group, and rename the menu curve type. And in the menu switch, I'll go over to node, and I'll say A is polycurve and B is freehand curve. And now under curve type, with these selected, I can change this to freehand. And there we go. Drop any comments down below if there's anything that's not clear. And if you make your own pipe assets, I'd love to see them. So feel free to reach out, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. I'll see you next time.